to look at is Beyond Disclosure, in the speech from Paul Harrison, which is titled Where is the Consumer in Consumer Protection? Probably nowhere. But, and then we're going to have a panel discussion to actually dig deeper into perhaps some of the questions that are in the synopsis. And I'll just read the synopsis that, you know, the Australian regulatory regime relies heavily on a program of disclosure to help consumers make appropriate financial choices. However, despite the amount and quality of information available, consumers don't always get to make decisions that are in their best economic interest. Where do consumers get information from and how do they process it? How can understanding consumer behaviour assist policymakers in government and business to help people make better decisions? And where does marketing fit into the way consumers make choices? Do we need something beyond disclosure to assist retail investors to make the right choices? And Paul's going to help us in that discussion today. Dr. Paul Harrison is the Deakin School, Graduate School of Business at the Deakin University. He is an academic, a researcher, a blogger, and a filmmaker. He has a PhD in consumer behaviour and teaches consumer behaviour and marketing in the Master of Business Administration at the Deakin Graduate School of Business. Also importantly, his research is focused on emotional and rational behaviour and actually how our biology and environment interact to influence the way we make decisions. And interestingly, I actually watched his short film, Shutting the Gates, which examined the psychology of the sale process and was voted as one of Australia's top 100 short films in 2010. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, everyone. I want to start by saying how thrilled I was to be asked to speak at the ASIC Summer School, because I think it's a great opportunity to talk about the research that I do and talk about it to a sophisticated, intelligent and engaged audience. It's also an opportunity to perhaps challenge some of those truths about what it is to be human, particularly in the area of decision-making, regulation and decision-making. And it's not, as our Professor of Accounting, Economics and Finance said to me yesterday, marching into the lion's den. I'm hoping that you'll be very caring with me. So my sincere thanks to ASIC for inviting me to speak to you. But what I want to do is I want to start with a little movie.
When it comes to relieving arthritis pain, you may think some prescription NSAID pain relievers like ibuprofen and naproxen don't have any cardiovascular risks. But based on the available research, that's not clear. And if you look closer, the FDA requires all these NSAID pain relievers, including Celebrex, to have the same cardiovascular warning. Any prescription NSAID, including Celebrex, may increase the chance of heart attack or stroke, which can lead to death. This chance increases if you have heart disease or risk factors for it, such as high blood pressure or when NSAIDs are taken for long periods. All NSAIDs, including Celebrex, also increase the chance of serious skin reactions or stomach and intestine problems, such as bleeding and ulcers, which can occur without warning and may cause death. With any of these medicines, patients also taking aspirin and the elderly are at increased risk for stomach bleeding and ulcers. While all NSAIDs have some of the same warnings, they all treat arthritis pain. But since individual results may vary, having options is important. An NSAID like Celebrex may be one option. In fact, prescription Celebrex has never been taken off the market. Based on the available data, the FDA stated that for certain patients, Celebrex's benefits outweigh the risks. But only you and your doctor can make that decision. Let's dive deeper. In clinical studies, a lower percentage of patients on Celebrex reported indigestion, abdominal pain, and nausea versus prescription ibuprofen and naproxen. Celebrex can be used with low-dose aspirin. Other prescription NSAIDs aren't generally recommended with aspirin. Celebrex relieves arthritis pain, stiffness, and inflammation. Just one 200 milligram dose provides 24-hour relief. Do not take Celebrex if you're pregnant or have had allergic reactions to aspirin or sulfonamides. And tell your doctor if you've had kidney or liver problems. For many with arthritis pain, not treating is not an option. Talk to your doctor about Celebrex and see what's right for you. Understand the risks, see the benefits.
I like to refer to that ad as the, it might kill you, but please buy it. And when she says, let's dive deeper, which is about 2 minutes in, I'm thinking, what? We haven't finished. But actually, here's the full text. And it's only 332 words, or about 3/4 of a standard page of information. Now, there will be a test at the end, so I'm hoping that you took all of that information in. But this, we're not talking anything extreme here, 332 words, 3/4 of a page. This is, and this was just my quick research online, this is the first 2 of 29 pages of the terms and conditions for NAB online trading. It's 660 words of 5,023, a bit of a difference. But I'm reckoning that most of you probably tuned out of the Celebrex plain language statement after about 30 seconds. So it doesn't actually bode well for the 4,469 words that I've got to go. But I'll ignore the evidence in front of me and plough on with the hope that I can be more engaging than NSAID and arthritis pain drug disclosures. So let's dive deeper. I want to start by actually trying to correct any of the misconceptions about my research domain. I'm actually not a behavioural economist. I'm not even an economist. And not that there's anything wrong with economists. I mean, some of my best friends are economists. I'm a consumer behaviourist. My research field is broadly in the area of social psychology and the social impacts of business. And I also want to say that I'm not a financial specialist. So I may be going into areas that you may have already ventured, and I will probably make technical mistakes and a few assumptions, and I apologise in advance. But what I hope to achieve today is to start a conversation in the sector around the key themes highlighted in the synopsis for my talk. If we assume, as Greg said, that despite the amount and quality of information available, consumers don't always make decisions that are in their best economic interests, what can we do to create an environment for better consumer outcomes? So there are a couple of key questions that I want to start to address this morning. First of all, is it possible for consumers to actually make an appropriate choice? Where do consumers actually get information from, and how do they actually process it? And what would a marketer do to get you to make what we might consider the best choice? You see, my plan this morning is to divide the talk into 3 parts. The first part will be a quick examination of the philosophical and ideological foundations of our current thinking around regulation, law, and human behaviour. The reason that I actually want to do this is to give you a sense of how we come to the place that we are in our current thinking. The second part will be an attempt to give you a crash course, something that we run over 3 years, in some basic theories of psychology, decision making and information processing. And it is literally a potpourri, just a selection to whet your appetite. And you probably come across lots of these terms, lots of the things that I'll be talking about. You may have even read about them in books like Nudge, A Mind of Its Own, and my favourite at the moment by Jennifer Ackerman called Sex, Sleep, Eat and Dream. It's worth reading, not just for the first word. And the third part will be an attempt to plant the seeds of a conversation about how we might reconsider the actual frame by which we approach consumer protection, regulation and better decision making. But I don't want to go the usual path of offering a few pithy tactical responses or quick fixes. To be honest, as I hope I'll explain, it's a bit more complicated than that. And I don't think a few ideas, quick ideas, will suffice. And realistically, I'm an academic. I'm pathologically opposed to simplification. But what I want to do is I want to start by taking a broad view of consumer behaviour, of economics, of business and of regulation. And I do have to start by laying my cards on the table. I have some concerns about the concept of regulation, at least contemporary interpretations of it. That said, I actually don't have a problem with the idea of protecting consumers or of regulations or legislation or laws. My major issue is more about the current interpretation and nature of much regulation. I worry that so much of our legal system is built around isolated incidents and reacting to negative outcomes. I'm happy to be corrected, but as a consumer researcher and advocate, the impression I get is that the focus of much regulation is either at the point of sale or related to redressing problems post-purchase. One clear example, I think, that I've been involved with is in this focus on dispute resolution. And it may be a reflection of the organisations that I work with, such as the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman, the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network and the Consumer Action Law Centre. It also concerns me that our current regime of regulation tends to be reactive and reductive, focusing in on specific, often individual problems and assuming that these problems are anomalies. And yes, much of the problems that we encounter in everyday life are anomalies, but I would say that this is the case by accident rather than by design. When it comes to regulation and legal processes, I'm actually often a bit perplexed by how we assume that life is rational and objective. My hope then is for the smart people in the room, and I'm assuming that's all of you, to start to begin to question the shape of much regulation. The implication, obviously, is that the current frame is inadequate. And to quote social philosopher Zygmunt Bauman, we actually desperately need a new framework, one that can accommodate and organise our experience in a fashion that allows us to perceive its logic and read its message, heretofore hidden, illegible or susceptible to misreading. Okay? I would like to change the way that we think and talk about regulation, to question the underlying ideology and to examine whether the current regulatory system is sufficient at a macro level to address the complexity of a world that keeps changing faster than our ways of thinking and talking about it can adapt, to take a longer view, to shift the paradigm and to perhaps shift the ideological frame. And if we do this, we might have to start by questioning some of the foundations upon which the legal and regulatory system is built before we can even begin to offer solutions. So this is probably going to be one of those talks that end up with us having more questions than answers. And judging by the discussions that I've sat in on in the last couple of sessions, that actually seems to be a theme of this conference. But I'm okay with that. And I'm assuming that I was invited to speak today about this because this is what I do. And from my perspective, it's actually a more enlightened view of the experience of what it is to be human. Steven Pinker, the author of How the Mind Works, provides a beautifully succinct summary of what it is to be human. The choices we make typically reflect our desires. We choose what, all things considered, we want. The process by which we make choices is pretty straightforward. We consider the pros and cons of a particular choice and perhaps even do a more formal cost-benefit analysis. After weighing up our options, we choose. For the most part, it's a process that's carried out in the conscious mind. Pretty straightforward, right? Wrong. The reality is that we may actually try to proceed in a rational manner, but the analytic process is a bit of a sham. We might attempt to draw up a mental list of pros and cons if we can stretch our lazy conscious minds to undertake the process. But the problem with these types of lists is that we habitually cheat in their construction. All of us, even economists and lawyers, are drawn towards information that's easily accessible, fits in with our current worldview, requires little cognitive resources, and is easy to understand. Which brings me to the examination of the biases, habits, and predispositions of humans. What I would like to do is talk about some key ideas under a particular theme that I think is relevant to today's discussion. Information processing. So how do we process information? Well, as you've probably guessed, in the world of the human mind, all information is not equal. As Jacob Jacoby from the Stern Business School at New York University wrote in 1977, there appears to be definite limits to the amount of information that can be accommodated and effectively processed during a limited time span by consumers in arriving at purchase decisions. Differences in our experiences, our memories, and even the construction of knowledge means that we all invariably evaluate external stimuli in different ways. Even two highly rational beings may assign different interpretations to the very same incoming information. In fact, the only people who think rationally, whether choosing a house, a financial investment, or even a spouse, have serious brain damage or psychopathology. In Descartes' era, the neurologist Antonio Damasio describes patients with damage to regions of the frontal lobe involved in decision-making, who fit the model of rationality. In one case, a patient spent over 30 minutes trying to decide which date and time would be optimal for the next appointment. Without an emotional signal to say this isn't worth the effort, he continued to weigh the utility of every possible alternative. The more we know about psychological phenomena, the more we realise that much information processing occurs at a level outside of our conscious reach. One theory that helps to explain this is what's called the dual processing model. I hope I'm not getting too technical, you're all very smart. The best way to think about how we process information is to see our decisions as being a product of dual minds. Now, this is something that's been around in psychology for about 30 years. These dual minds, sometimes referred to as the emotional and the rational, sometimes referred to as explicit and implicit attitudes, sometimes as reflective and unconscious, operate most of the time in tight harmony and intertwine their comprehension of the world without us knowing. A gut feeling is incorporated with a rational assessment of utility. And these dual processing models generally work together well, with the implicit attitudes and knowledge informing the operating of the rational or reflective knowledge and decision making. But when passions surge, when information is overwhelming, when we are stressed, confused, time poor, overconfident, or simply tired, the emotional mind or the implicit attitudes have the upper hand and literally overpower the conscious, rational, and reflective mind. So if we're tired or stressed, confused or struggling, we're likely to use peripheral emotional, social and impulsive cues such as trust, inertia or external stimuli such as our perceived relationship with the person selling us a product to assess whether we are making a good decision. And the worst bit is we're not aware that this is happening. This all happens outside of our reflective capacity. What we think we are experiencing is the truth, but we're a product of our finite processing capabilities. And an extension of this is that we've all evolved to take shortcuts. One way to think about automaticity is to actually see the mind as having finite processing capacity. And the goal at all times is to reduce the amount of effort required to make our way through our lives. Much of our everyday life, thinking, feeling, doing, is automatic. Classic example, driving a car, in that it's actually driven by what we're experiencing in the environment, such as the people around us and their behaviour, the objects within our consciousness, and social norms. And then mediated by automatic processing of these features rather than by this assumed conscious choice or reflection. It's a really simple argument. We all have limited cognitive resources. We seek to find the most efficient way to use those resources. So when we make a choice, we rely on the resources that are most easily accessed and processed. It isn't necessarily the most useful information, but it's the information that requires the least cognitive effort, and we can't escape it. We all do it, every minute of every day. In other words, even the choices we make are a product of our limited capacity to process detailed information. Counterintuitively, by offering consumers choice, we also push up against another flaw in the human mind. Giving people choice is important and useful, but only for the people who are able to commit the energy involved in considering the options. We also know that choice itself is a bit of a complex phenomena. Many of you may now be aware of the research by Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, but it's been reported about in the media as well, that showed the human ability and desire to manage choice is limited. As they say in their article, the benefits associated with the provision of choice may be limited to issues in which decision complexity is manageable. As decision complexity rises, the very provision of choice, which is seemingly desirable and beneficial, can become paralysing and debilitating, resulting in suboptimal decision making. Their research, conducted in both the field and the laboratory, found that people are likely to purchase gourmet jams, chocolates, and even undertake optional class assignments when they're offered a limited array of choices. In their research, they suggested that 6 choices was the optimum number if you wanted people to actually choose, rather than an extensive array of 24 or 30 choices. And they also found that participants in the 6 choices group recorded higher satisfaction with their selections, and in relation to the optional class assignment, they got higher marks for their essays when the number of options was limited. And in relation to investment in super schemes in the US, the 401k option, Iyengar, Jiang and Kamanika's 2006 research showed that giving people more choices resulted in them putting their money into lower risk options, which on average yielded lower returns. And the social discourse around choice doesn't help either. We're constantly told that the only way forward is to give people more choice. Again from the article, the presumption that people are never worse off and are usually better off as a result of making their own choices may not necessarily be true. Human beings have always showed ambivalence toward being in control. On the one hand, they strive for self-determination and personal causation, but on the other hand, they show a tendency to relinquish control and escape freedom. This may be where I'm making assumptions, but competition policy is predicated on a principle that choice as a concept results in better consumer outcomes. That by giving people more choices, they're in control, when in fact that control might be like IKEA, a bit of a veneer. We're more complicated than the neoliberal rationalist discourse would suggest. Much of the time we would prefer not to choose. A study published last year that provided people with the information to understand the costs of choice freedom outweigh its benefits found that these people still predict that choice freedom will lead to better performance. So even when we know that reduced choice will not lead to better decisions, we still resist the notion, simply because we've absorbed the conversation that the only way to create competition is to give consumers as many choices as possible. The bottom line with giving people choices is that you need to understand how people choose and when and why they don't. Step by step, as we walk through each psychological door in the decision-making process, our choices are made for us, so that at the point when we think we're choosing, we've closed so many doors behind us, psychological doors obviously, the decision has pretty much been made. Our rational brain tells us that we're in control. Having said all of this, I need to say that I'm not a neurofundamentalist. Yes, we're a product of our predispositions and biases, but we're also a product of our culture and our environment. And it's our culture and our environment that can go some way towards influencing our predispositions and biases. So what are the solutions? Well, listening to this morning's conversation, I discovered this just the other day. I haven't actually written it down, but I'll let you read it. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that financial advisors and financial people are soothsayers and fortune tellers, but I'm sure that would put the cat among the pigeons to some degree. Anyway, but it's not simply a case of telling consumers to read the terms and conditions. As many people discovered after the tragic Queensland and Victorian floods, even plain language statements are not likely to be read, at least in any detail. But this isn't a criticism of consumers. Everyone does it.
The insurance industry has been facing some criticism about policies being complicated in terms of whether the flood cover is for a river flood or a flash flood or a problem with storm water. What do you say to that criticism?
Most of the definitions are written in very plain English and are very simple for a layman to understand. Unfortunately, a lot of people maybe don't make the effort to understand what the risks are that they're facing.
Why do you think that is?
Look, complacency is one angle. Before I joined the industry, I think I was probably one of those people who didn't pay a lot of attention to reading my policy documents. I certainly do nowadays.
The Insurance Council's General Manager of Risk, Carl Sullivan, with any guest in Brisbane.
As far as I can ascertain then in Carl Sullivan's logic is that we all just need to join the Insurance Council and then we'll read our terms and conditions. And following on from that logic, obviously if we want people to read their financial their financial disclosures, we should probably all just get jobs at ASIC perhaps, or the ACCC or a bank, and then we'll most likely read our financial contracts. But the statement is an important point. We're unlikely to read the details or even the basics of a product disclosure statement, even if it is in plain language, until the abstract becomes the concrete. People only went and looked at their insurance plain language statements after something had happened to them. And as Steven Pinker says, human beings are intelligent, impatient beings.
Hi! So you know what I ignore a lot? Physics.
I'm pretty smooth.
But my favourite thing to ignore are terms and conditions. And like all things that are too difficult, I just agree.
What the? Terms and conditions? Oh, man, like I'm gonna read this. Look how many words there are. Psh, I just want to play online Scrabble. Alright, agree.
Please wait while Scrabble loads. Congratulations, you are now part of online Scrabble.
Thank you. And just between you and me, I'm really worried that one day this will happen.
Hi, Natalie Tran? Are you from the video shop? Because I returned that DVD ages ago.
Oh, no.
So I don't even know why you guys are called a video shop. You don't have videos, it's just DVD.
I'm from the Scrabble website you signed up to a couple of months ago. I'm here to collect the things you agreed to in your terms and conditions.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm here to collect your soul.
What?
You didn't tick the terms and conditions without reading it, did you?
Congratulations, you are now part of online Scrabble.
Thank you.
I don't know how to give you my soul. I don't even know if I have one. My phone is ringing. I just, one second, stay. But you tick the box.
Hello? Hi, I'm from that porn site that you signed up to last night. Which one? In terms and conditions you agreed to, you said that I could film you. What? You said I could film you. You ticked the box.
I mean, it's kind of concerning. It's like if you did this.
Hey Nat, you want a lolly?
What do I have to give you?
You have to give me everything. Everything for a lolly. Yeah.
Okay.
It's Natalie Tran Community Channel. It's a YouTube phenomenon for those of you who aren't au fait with YouTube. But where does consumer protection fit into this? Can policy, legislation and education counter these effects? Well, I'd actually like to present the panel and the audience with a challenge. I would like to use the discussion to push the limits of our thinking, to use this as an opportunity, at least in the first instance, to try and think a bit differently, to change the frame of how we approach the product. I want the panel, and I haven't told Greg about this, to talk about these issues, to talk about these issues without limits. What would they really like to do if there were no restrictions to their ideas? In marketing, we talk about this as the potential product. Our goal is to help consumers make the appropriate choices while trying to counter all of the internal and external forces that may influence their choice. When we think about consumers, decision making and even consumer protection, we're talking about a product, an idea and a benefit. In a sense, I'd like to think of this as a new product development opportunity. We know that people will use shortcuts when they're making a decision. We know that people are impatient, intelligent beings. We know that people are busy. We know that people take risks. We know that taking risks is not always a bad thing. We know that most people don't read product disclosure statements. We know that most people don't read the terms and conditions. And we know that most people, pretty much all of us, don't read the fine print. So let's think like a marketer, not a lawyer or an economist. Not that there's anything wrong with lawyers and economists. I mean, some of my best friends are lawyers and economists. Let's actually develop a new product, a better way to do consumer protection. And if we're talking about what other countries or jurisdictions are doing or planning to do, let's talk about their substance and why they might work rather than simply borrowing ideas or copying them. In my experience, the best way to think about the potential product is to start with the benefit in mind. In marketing, we talk about creating products based on the benefits that they provide to consumers. So let's talk openly about what benefits we want for consumers. What do we actually want people to do? What I'm saying is that we need to put the consumer back into consumer protection. We have to more thoroughly understand consumer behaviour in all its complexity before we design programs to get them to behave the way that we hope is the most appropriate way for them to behave. So if we're truly serious about helping consumers to make better decisions rather than protecting our asses, then let's approach this in a more sophisticated way. And let's dream big. Let's borrow ideas from other disciplines, industries and sectors. Let's think of all the possible permutations and ideas limited only by imagination and maybe budget that could lead to the desired behaviour. But this is definitely not a revisiting of the product disclosure statement. That would be a little bit like adding a computer to a fridge. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but in the end no one was actually using it. I hesitate to say it, but what we might be looking at is a complete revisiting of how we approach consumer protection, knowing what we currently know about decision making. So how would this look? Firstly, I want to say that there are always going to be mistakes, and there are always going to be people who make mistakes. And we don't want to completely remove the opportunities for people to make mistakes or take risks. If people don't take risks, there's not going to be innovation. Somehow we have to find a happy medium. I'll give you a few starters to think about, but these are just my initial ideas. They're also based on a fairly restricted understanding of the product category, but with more knowledge about the product, I'm confident that we can apply the broad range of research in similar fields to any context. The underlying constant is that we're dealing with people. Hopefully we can discuss this with the panel in a minute. The first step might be intervention. It might be actually about anticipating problems. We need people outside of the law contributing to regulation. We need alternative perspectives that somehow take into consideration the reality of human behaviour. See, I'd like to see this happen as legislation, policy or regulation is being drafted. I would also like to see this as financial products are developed. What this might mean is that the regulator has to be more proactive rather than reactive. Perhaps regulation could go through a due diligence or stress testing process, which has been mentioned in the past, but with consumer behaviour specialists, so that we know that it's actually going to achieve what the lawyers are hoping it will achieve. And on the supply side, maybe products should also go through a due diligence process or product piloting. In the same way that a marketer would go through a piloting process to see if people would buy their product, maybe some products should go through a piloting process to see if they might cause harm. And not just through a legal process, through a process that analyses potential consumer behaviour. In the same way that we seek legal advice about consumer policy, we should probably also seek consumer advice, consumer behaviour advice. Maybe not on all products, but perhaps products that have more potential for harm. And not necessarily to rule out any risks, but simply to understand those risks. Another issue to be thinking about is time. We know that time can reduce the effects of a range of these biases. And when I say time, I'm not simply referring to cooling off periods. Research that I conducted last year into the psychology of in-home sales, as Greg mentioned, confirmed that the way time works to influence these biases is more complex than it seems. My research and other research in this area has found that cooling off periods, certainly the way most of them operate, don't overcome many of the biases of human behaviour. The problem with the current cooling off periods, or at least the ones that I'm aware of, is that they operate after we've purchased something or committed to an agreement. By then, it's too late. The endowment effect, the status quo bias, endowed progress effect and ego protection theory, which I'm happy to chat with you about later, I know that I've just put you all to sleep, tell us all that once a person owns something, they value it more and are less likely to give it up. At least in the short term, particularly if they've put mental, physical or social effort into their decision. We also know that it takes a significant amount of cognitive resources to admit we made a mistake. Again, this is not a conscious use of our resources, but it happens regardless of how rational we think we are. The role of our ego is to protect us. So out of our conscious reach, our ego creates defences, including apathy, that restricts us from changing our mind after we've become endowed with something. Perhaps we need to go back to the original intent and construction of cooling off periods, which came into force before you made a final decision or killed your neighbour. In Saxon times, according to the Life of King Alfred, published around 888 AD, if someone had killed a member of your family, it was acceptable to go straight to their house and bump them off.
But Alfred now made an inspired change to the law, so that instead of settling the score immediately, now you had to wait 7 days before acting. Waiting 7 days before you take your revenge is a brilliantly simple idea. It was the original cooling off period. You let people's anger die down and let rational thought take over. After the first day, you'd probably start to think a bit more calmly and begin to wonder if it really was worth killing the bloke who'd made you so angry. A couple of days later, you might start bumping into the person that you wanted to take your revenge on. You might even start talking to him.
Hello.
Hello. All right. He might even persuade you that he didn't want to hurt you in the first place. And before the 7 days were over, you'd probably genuinely calm down and toddle off down the pub.
So if we're going to have cooling off periods and agreements, they have to come before the contract is signed, or at least before the consumer has made a social, emotional commitment. One way to do this is something that I call a double opt-in clause. And it sounds a little bit like the opt-in clause that was talked about earlier. In my research into in-home sales, I found that once consumers actually had signed a large financial contract for a pretty poor educational program, their likelihood of cancelling that contract within 10 days was actually quite remote. But if we required cooling off periods to start once an intention to buy was made, a consumer would have more time and resources to think about the consequences. If they were to say, or even sign something to commit to this product but not actually legally commit to it, and then sign a second document at least 48 hours after the initial intention to purchase, then we actually remove the pressure and psychological biases associated with the endowment effect, ego depletion and prospect theory. Time has that effect. There has been a lot of research on how we frame information. Some refer to it as choice architecture. And I don't want to get too carried away looking at all the different methods that framing affect decision making, but I do want to mention a couple of aspects of framing that are quite relevant. The first one is language. If we already know that people are unlikely to read the terms and conditions, how do we use language to get people to at least engage with some of the material provided to them? Here's some of the things that we know about language. We know that polite and formal language signifies and creates psychological and personal distance. In other words, the use of normative polite language, the language that we use in business and law, rather than colloquial, less polite language, leads people to believe that the target of the communication, them, is spatially and temporarily distant. In research published last year, when participants read or heard a formal statement such as, "My brother is taking our family car, so the rest of us will stay at home," they believed that the person who was being addressed was not them, in a more remote location, and the conversation referred to something that might happen in the future. A better way to put the same statement would be, "My brother is taking our family car, so the rest of us will be stuck at home." We also know that hypothetical language, such as "this may happen to you," affects the perception of distance and concreteness, in that people don't expect hypothetical events to occur, at least to them, or in the near future. So if we want people to take notice, language should be direct, immediate, and personal. And in the same vein, the layout and format of information should be more about comprehension and less about formality. The most important information should be upfront, rather than following a more formal logical structure, what people might say is common sense. The things that you want people to read should be early and in bold. These are simple ideas, but it always surprises me how illogical logic actually is. And there's one other thing that marketing can bring to the table. If we're going to take decision making seriously, one of the answers has to be related to segmentation. In marketing, when we talk about segmentation, what we mean is that we design the entire marketing program, not just promotional and communication activities, around the different consumers that we wish to persuade. So in a practical sense, we have to avoid the tendency to go for a one-size-fits-all approach when designing products, and also when designing consumer protection. The challenge is that this would require a deeper understanding of consumer behaviour, more resources, and of how groups behave, and will undoubtedly need more targeted resources depending on vulnerability. It would also require a more sophisticated view of vulnerability, beyond simplistic demographic profiling. Segmentation isn't demographics. It's about understanding the factors that contribute to understanding, to attitudes, and, importantly, to behaviours. And then designing those programs that suit that particular understanding, attitude or behaviour. And we all belong to different groups for different products, stimuli and activities. Marketers do this every day. All this requires a new way of thinking. And without oversimplifying the issue, we have to stop being so logical and be strategic. In order to achieve this, rational choice theory, the Homo economicus concept, has to be abandoned in favour of a more realistic view of the individual. In a nutshell, let's start with the premise that we are less rational than we all think we are and work from there. So I want to leave you with a final theory, which is a good conclusion to my talk and might help you to understand why we often find it hard to remember details of a speech or an event once that event has concluded. It's called the Pekan Rule. Actually, many of you will probably remember more of this because you're taking a lot more notes than my students ever do. According to the Pekan Rule, we judge our past experiences almost entirely on how they were at their peak, pleasant or unpleasant, and how they ended. Virtually all information appears to be discarded, including net pleasantness or unpleasantness, and even how long that experience lasted. One everyday example of the Pekan Rule is related how we might remember our holidays. Our memories aren't linear. We don't remember our experiences in real time, nor do we remember our experiences in the order that they occurred. What we do remember about our holidays seem to be the highlights, the time when I got stung by a blue bottle at Terrigal Beach, or the first time that I beat my brother in a swing race. It's the same with witness accounts. Often the witness or the victim remembers the extreme moments of the crime experience rather than its entirety. And it's also the case with very long, boring speeches. In years to come, hopefully what you remember about my talk was this. Thank you for your time.